Yeah, hello. My name is John Flanders. I'm a retired railroad machinist, and I'm talking to Joe Mulligan, a working locomotive engineer, about the changes that the railroads are trying to, and the FRA are allowing the railroads to make in regards to safety. But first of all, I wanted to ask you, Joe, um, what, give us a little bit of your background as a locomotive engineer and whatever you can say about your experience in the industry.
Sure, John. Thank you. I work as a locomotive engineer in passenger service. I'm a essential employee right now, so all of us here in our operation are continuing to work on reduced schedules, but we're still working, um, hopefully to help alleviate the situation here in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New Hampshire. Uh, my background not only is in passenger train operations, but also I've had a lot of experience as a locomotive engineer and conductor in freight service, working in interstate and local service. So I'm familiar with a lot of the very specific changes that the industry organizations have successfully lobbied for, and I'm very concerned about what they proposed and what has already been approved, and that's why we hope we can talk about it.
Okay, as I understand it, the Federal Railroad Administration has issued a sweeping revocation of rules that the railroads are supposed to observe in terms of safety. The general public is concerned, of course, because they ride on passenger trains, and they're concerned recently about the amount of highly volatile oil that's traveling by rail that exploded in Lac Megantic in Quebec and so on and so forth. Could you talk a little bit about what the FRA is up to in terms of, again, I'll say Federal Railroad Administration, the supervisory government body over the railroads, that what they're allowing the carriers to do that is new and different?
Sure. The proposal to the FRA, or the request for relief from regulation, was made to the FRA by three industry organizations: the Association of American Railroads, the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, and the American Public Transportation. So the industry organizations put forth an emergency request to be relieved from a lot of the safety requirements that have been a hallmark of the industry for hundreds of years. The old expression goes that all the rules in the railroad are written in blood. That these rules came about because of some tragedy that befell a community or individual railroaders, and as a result of those tragedies, these rules were developed. So the expression has always been that the rules in the railroad are written in blood. But the industry organizations worked swiftly to get this information in front of the FRA, and the FRA almost gave it a carte blanche approval very, very quickly, without any input at all from community organizations, from organized labor, from the traveling public, the people that work on the trains, the people that ride the trains, and the people that live in communities that are traversed by trains. Had absolutely no say in the approval of this emergency order. And the other troubling thing about the speed in which this request was granted is that, to our knowledge, there is no emergency shortage of personnel in the railroad industry at this time. Granted, a lot of this is in anticipation of serious personnel shortages, but they haven't occurred yet, and we're not quite sure why this was granted so rapidly without consideration of interested parties. And the other question it begs is, in our industry, there have been over 15 to 20,000 qualified, certified craft employees that have been laid off over the last year. And prior to adopting these kind of draconian methods that eliminate safety regulation and requirements, that no consideration is given to return any of those brothers and sisters to the ranks of the working employed prior to asking for this emergency relief and relief from safety compliance. And I don't know, we can go in to talk about some of the specifics if you'd like at this point. What do you think, John?
Well, I mean, I think the general public would be concerned about the health and safety of workers, of course, and under the current circumstances of the pandemic. Also, you know, there's a lot of concern about trains going off the tracks with oil. And then, of course, passengers would be concerned about the safety of traveling in a crowded passenger car that's not kept very clean. Can you say anything about
Sure.
those two things?
Sure. I mean, this comprehensive change, I can go through it to address some of these issues. But if you're a member of the community, if you're interested in making sure that the trains that travel through your community are being maintained and inspected as they are supposed to be, you're going to be concerned about these issues. If you're riding trains and you're concerned about the crews that are on the trains and how well rested they are, or how well trained they are, or how well certified they are, you're going to be concerned. And as a working railroader, you want to be concerned that the people that you're working alongside are properly certified, trained, and qualified, and meeting all the standards to perform their job as you are required to do your job. So, I mean, we could talk immediately about this immediate 60-day relief was granted so that the railroads could be relieved from their responsibilities in a number of areas. The first one is the amount of frequency for track inspections. They're being relieved of the timetable requirements for inspecting track so that in the event of a labor shortage, they wouldn't be required to perform on the same schedule basis. So the tracks will be inspected less. Tracks are inspected less, but continue to be used. They're subject to break. They're subject to have faults. Small faults become large faults, and large faults cause derailments or other operations problems that can impact the communities that the trains travel through. And this specific relief is something that's going to alleviate their responsibility to inspect the track on a regular basis. And that's going to create a dangerous situation for people on the train and the people around the trains. And moving on, when we talk about the people that operate the trains, there's certain tests, operational tests, that are required on a regular basis, that every locomotive engineer, every conductor be evaluated in the field to make sure that they fully understand what their responsibilities are and that they're properly certified to do their job. The railroads are being relieved of that responsibility, which means it's kind of like there's no cop by the side of the road with a radar gun. As a locomotive engineer, I don't really like to come around the corner and see a radar gun, but that operational testing is a vital component in the overall safety network to make sure that we're all doing our job properly. And truth be told, I don't want to see any of those safeguards or safeties removed. Another item that they're being relieved from is the responsibility to properly certify and test their conductors and locomotive engineers. As a locomotive engineer, I have to be fully versed on the topography, on the track structure, on the signal system, everything that's going to allow me to get the train from point A to point B safely. I have to know my speed limits. I have to know where I am at all times. And the railroads are being relieved from placing crews on these trains that have to maintain that level of qualification. So if a labor shortage did exist, rather than recalling some of the 15,000 employees that have been laid off, they're going to put a locomotive engineer on a train that doesn't necessarily have any familiarity with the track in which he or she is operating over. So that removal of the certification and qualification requirements for locomotive engineers and conductors can create a hazardous safety environment. And if you look on, as I go through page after page of the 17-page emergency order, there are certain responsibilities that crews have to secure their trains and to properly communicate to the relieving crew information regarding that train. And due to the fact that they're saying that employees might not want to meet face-to-face, they are being relieved of those requirements of doing what are called quick tie-ups. And that due diligence requirement on the part of a crew taking a train over from another crew is critical. You have to know what you're getting on, what kind of a train you're getting on, or what special characteristics it might have. And so not having that interface, not having that tie down, not communicating to the company the specific information about the train when you left it, might not in itself cause a problem, but it's one of those components that, if involved in some sort of perfect storm of events, can create real tragedy.
The other question would
Sure.
question would be, you know, with thousands of people laid off, and there's millions unemployed now at this point because of this crisis. It would seem to me that the general public ought to be concerned about the fact that the existing employees that still have jobs must be highly stressed because of all the worry about their families and the virus and all the rest of it, and then overworking them on top of that rather than utilizing the qualified employees that do exist. I mean, that's outrageous from a public safety point of view.
Right. I mean, not only you removing that safety net of regulation, but you're talking about putting folks out to work in that environment that you just described, where there's stress at home, there's stress on the job. Are you being given all the personal protective equipment that you need if you're interacting with the public as a passenger service conductor, trainman, or engineer? Are you being afforded the proper PPE if you're working in freight service? So the locomotive cab that you're getting into have been properly sanitized, cleaned. Those are all the kinds of things that build the kind of stress that you're describing. So you compound that all together with the relief and regulation. I guess that's another component in that perfect storm that might exist someday that'll cause real tragedy.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and then there's also the question of the freight railroads moving freight that is frankly quite unnecessary. I mean, we don't need to be moving automobiles right now. We need to be moving food and making sure the country is fed. And I doubt that that's a major concern for the freight railroads.
I mean, I guess that's a whole, grander discussion when you talk about. A lot of people think that many of the carriers have lost focus and lost vision, lost their way in terms of what their responsibilities are as common carriers. In precision scheduled railroading, that system of railroad operations has come into play over the last 5 to 10 years, has brought many railroad operations down to that bare bone minimum where they're unable to focus on safety, unable to focus on many of the traditional responsibilities of the craft jobs like mechanics, machinists, signal maintainers, locomotive engineers, conductors. Those jobs that they have maintained over hundreds of years and developed, that many of which are just being cast aside in an effort to reduce total headcount and make their investment community happier with their operating ratios. So, I mean, there's a lot going on to that question that you asked, a lot more than has to do with the pandemic. It's just, I think the pandemic is bringing a spotlight onto the bare bones nature of American railroad operations.
Right. I mean, for example, getting back to the rules for a second, as a railroad machinist, I did a lot of air brake work in the last part of my career. And we had to sign a federal form on every locomotive saying that the air brakes were working properly. I mean,
Right.
is that one of the things that they're waiving in this FRA paper?
Right. I mean, as a locomotive engineer, I go through things that certainly make more sense to me, and I say, oh my gosh, how can this happen? If I had your background, I'd be looking at another portion of this 17-page monstrosity and say, you can't do that. With your background, you'd say, that makes absolutely no sense. So some of the things I could mention that would immediately bring concern to you is that locomotives can leave diesel houses, servicing facilities without inspection paperwork.
Really?
if they don't have the staff, if everyone's been taken down and there's no available staff, that locomotive can leave the facility without a daily inspection. And long distance trains that have left, I don't know exactly. I mean, my neck of the woods, we don't have long distance trains like this, but trains that travel thousands of miles are relieved from en route mechanical and air brake inspections. So that train that travels 2,000 miles isn't stopping midway for that inspection, or I think it's 1,200 miles for a Class 1A supplemental brake test. So the trains would in essence be pushed longer, further, without en route inspections. Locomotives could come out of facilities without being properly inspected. And those systems in the facilities that you're used to, like yard air, which is what the supply of compressed air to remote tracks so that cars can be tested without a locomotive being around. Those inspection requirements for maintaining yard air would also be relieved. So also the calibration of safety and testing devices like air gauges, they're relieved from that. So as someone in your profession, your craft, you'd be out there working or being relieved from doing the responsible tests that you've been told in the past could not be missed, could not be avoided, that you would work, under penalty of discipline if you didn't comply with. So suddenly, some of that testing is no longer required. The way tests are, for example, a train is always required to have 100% of its brakes operational leaving the facility. Under this requirement, only 95% of the brakes have to work. And that's just something for me and for you. We can both shake our heads and say, we never let a train leave a facility without 100% working brakes. So, with such an experienced pool of craftsmen out there, they're able to perform this work. They're all sitting laid off. One of our principal concerns is we can improve our safety, maintain our safety, improve or maintain the safety of our trains traveling through these communities by bringing people back to work that know how to do these things that they're being relieved from the responsibility of performing.
Yeah, I mean, we should remember that the Lac Megantic tragedy started with air brakes that leaked off, and the train rolled down a hill and blew up the town, killed 50 people.
Exactly. I mean, I was able to obtain a copy of the Canadian Transport Commission's report on Megantic, and in addition to describing those things you just did, those failures that occurred in the field, they were able to document the lapses in protocol for weeks prior to that on those specific locomotives. That those locomotives have been reported as deficient, defective, and because that railroad is no longer in business, thankfully, but that railroad did not maintain these strict protocols that you and I have been trained to adhere to all our careers, and as a result, Megantic occurred. So it wasn't just. It was, again, more of a perfect storm of events than simply that one-person crew making a mistake. There is a history backing up that says mechanical things went wrong that should have been solved, all because appropriate protocol was ignored. What we're trying to prevent is that similar thing occurring again. And certainly most American railroads operate better than that little railroad did on the Central Maine in Quebec to cause that problem. But those things could occur with this relief provision from the rules.
Right. Well, is there anything else you would like to go over, Joe, before we wind this interview up?
Well, I mean, I've tried to give it in a nutshell without getting too deep. It's a 17-page thing. I could mention. We could talk for hours about this. The critical thing I think we believe is, as professional railroaders, is that these rules and regulations are put in place for a specific reason, to make sure that we work in a safe environment, that the people that ride our trains are carried in a safe environment, and those communities that we traverse can go to sleep at night knowing that there are professional railroaders out there making sure that the trains are operating safely through their communities. The relief from these regulations is premature, and with the large amount, finally, to say once again, beat the point, to say that there are so many people out there unemployed, working craftsmen that can be available, that can be brought back to help alleviate this crisis if it does exist. That this 17-page emergency order is a step in the wrong direction for railroading and for our country.
Well, Joe Mulligan, thank you very much for this interview, and good luck out there on the rails.
Well, thanks, John, and let's hope we all get through this together quickly.
Yep.